If you're studying for the BCBA exam and you keep seeing whole interval, partial interval, momentary time sampling, and thinking, I kind of know these, but I'm not 100% confident, this lesson is for you. In this video, we're going to walk through discontinuous measurement step by step, how each method works, what it does to your data, and how the exam likes to ask about it, so that by the end, you can look at any scenario and quickly say, that's whole interval, that's partial, or that's MTS. All of this is based on the Discontinuous Measurement PPT from BCBA And if you want to go beyond this topic and practice with full mock exams and video walkthroughs, you'll find everything there, BCBA. Study smarter, not harder. Discontinuous measurement shows up a lot on the BCBA exam because it tests more than just whether you memorize definitions. The exam is checking if you understand how these methods affect measurement accuracy, when they overestimate, underestimate, or roughly match the true level of behavior, and whether you can pick the best method in a real-world scenario. Many people mix up whole versus partial interval or confuse partial interval with MTS, or they forget what gets missed when you only sample behavior instead of recording every instance. Once you really get what discontinuous measurement does to your data, these questions become easy points instead of trick questions. Let's define it clearly. Discontinuous measurement means you are not capturing every single instance of the target behavior. Instead, you only record behavior at selected points or within certain intervals of time. You're using slices of time, intervals, or check moments, instead of continuously tracking behavior from start to finish. We typically use these methods when behavior occurs at very high rates, when it's impractical to count every response, or when we just need a representative sample of behavior across time. So, in your mind, link discontinuous measurement with sampling rather than continuous recording. In this lesson, we're focusing on three main discontinuous methods: whole interval, partial interval, and momentary time sampling. With whole interval, the behavior must occur for the entire interval to be scored as yes. With partial interval, the behavior is scored if it occurs at any time during the interval, even once, even briefly. With momentary time sampling, behavior is scored only if it occurs at the exact moment the interval ends or at the designated check time. As we go, keep repeating to yourself, entire interval, any time in the interval, or at the check moment. That's the core difference the exam keeps testing. Before you choose which method to use, you always set up your observation first. You pick an observation period, maybe 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour, then divide it into equal intervals, like 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or 1 minute. You also define the target behavior very clearly, so anyone watching knows exactly what counts. From there, the method changes the question you ask yourself each interval. For whole interval, did it happen for the entire interval? For partial interval, did it happen at any time during the interval? For MTS, is it happening right now at this specific check time? Once you link each method to its question, it's much easier to remember. Whole interval recording means you only mark an interval as behavior occurred if the behavior happens for the entire interval with no breaks. If the behavior stops at any point during that interval, the interval is scored no. We usually use whole interval to estimate behaviors we want to increase and maintain over time, such as on-task behavior, sustained engagement, or appropriate sitting. Because the standard is so strict, this method tends to underestimate the actual amount of behavior, especially if behavior is brief or comes in bursts. On the exam, anytime the STEM says the behavior must be present for the whole interval to get a yes, you should immediately think whole interval recording. Let's make that more concrete. Imagine you have 10-second intervals during a 10-minute independent work period, and your target is on task, defined as eyes on work, writing, or reading. You score yes only if the student is on task for all 10 seconds of the interval. If they look away or stop working for even a few seconds, it becomes a no. What happens? Short bursts of on-task behavior that don't fill the whole interval are scored as not on task. So whole interval tends to underestimate behavior, especially when performance is choppy or variable. That's why it's often chosen when your goal is to build more continuous behavior like engagement or appropriate sitting, not to perfectly reflect every brief occurrence. Partial interval flips that rule. Here, You mark an interval as behavior occurred if the behavior happens at any point during the interval. It doesn't matter how long it lasts or how many times it occurs. One occurrence is enough to score a yes. Partial interval is used to estimate whether behavior occurs at least once in an interval rather than how long it lasts. On exam questions, if the description says the observer records the behavior as present if it happens at any time during the interval, that's your clear signal that the method is partial interval recording. Picture a scenario with 10-second intervals tracking tantrum behavior. If tantrum occurs at any moment in a given interval, you score that interval as yes, even if the tantrum lasts just 1 second. Over time, this tends to overestimate the total amount of time the behavior occurs, especially when it's brief but frequent. That's why partial interval is commonly used for problem behaviors we want to decrease, like disruptive behavior, self-injury, or aggression, because it's sensitive to whether the behavior is happening at all. A classic exam tip you can memorize is, partial interval tends to overestimate high-rate behavior. Definition: momentary time sampling works a bit differently. At a pre-specified moment, usually the end of each interval, the observer looks up and records whether the behavior is occurring at that exact moment. The observer is not continuously watching. They simply check in when the timer goes off. MTS is especially useful in classrooms, groups, or settings where one person has to monitor multiple students or manage other tasks at the same time. On the exam, phrases like "at the end of each interval" or "when the timer beeps," the observer looks and records are big clues that the method being described is momentary time sampling. Imagine a teacher sets a timer to beep every minute. When it beeps, she looks to see whether the student is on task at that exact moment and records yes or no. She doesn't watch continuously, just at those beep times. MTS can overestimate or underestimate behavior depending on the pattern. For example, if the behavior tends to happen right after or right before checks, but over longer observation periods, it often gives a reasonable estimate of behavior levels. It's often chosen when you're observing groups or classrooms, or when the observer has other responsibilities and can't collect continuous or interval-by-interval data. Let's zoom out and compare all three methods. Whole interval scores yes, only if behavior occurs for the entire interval, and it tends to underestimate behavior, so it's often used for behaviors you want to increase, like on-task engagement. Partial interval scores yes if the behavior occurs at any time in the interval and tends to overestimate behavior, so it's commonly used for problem behaviors you want to decrease. MTS scores yes if the behavior is happening at the check moment and may over or underestimate behavior, but is practical in groups and classrooms. For the exam, watch for key phrases like entire interval, anytime during, or at the end of the interval to quickly identify which method the item is describing. Here's the big idea. Discontinuous methods are sampling behavior, not recording every second of it, so some error is built in. Partial interval can overestimate behavior because it counts any brief occurrence as if it fills the interval. Whole interval can underestimate behavior because it misses shorter or boundary behaviors that don't last the entire interval. MTS produces mixed error. It can over or underestimate depending on how behavior lines up with check times. On the exam, you'll see questions like, which method is most likely to overestimate behavior? That's partial interval. Or which method could underestimate brief behaviors? That's whole interval. If you keep the direction of bias straight, you'll pick the right answer more confidently. Let's practice thinking like the exam. I'll read a scenario, and you label it: whole interval, partial interval, or MTS. 1. An observer watches 10-second intervals and records a plus only if the student stays seated for the entire 10 seconds. 2. During 30-second intervals, the therapist marks an X if the client engages in any self-injury at any time in the interval. 3. The teacher sets a timer to beep every minute. When it beeps, she looks up and records whether the student is on task at that exact moment. 4. A behavior analyst divides a 20-minute period into 5-second intervals and records yes if any talking out occurs at any point in the interval. 5. A paraprofessional records yes if the student is quiet for the full interval. If the student talks at all, the interval is marked no. Hold your answers in your head, and we'll check them next. Let's go through the answers and reasoning together. Item 1 is whole interval recording, because the student must stay seated for the entire interval to get a yes. Item 2 is partial interval, since any self-injury at any time in the interval leads to a yes. Item 3 is momentary time sampling, because behavior is checked only at the exact moment the timer beeps. Item 4 is partial interval recording again. Behavior is counted if it happens at any point in each interval. Item 5 is whole interval, because the student must be quiet for the full interval to be scored as yes. Notice how the wording, entire interval, anytime during, or at the check moment, tells you exactly which method is being described. Now let's talk about traps the exam likes to set. One big trap is confusing partial interval with MTS. In partial interval, the observer watches the whole interval and records if the behavior happens at any point. In MTS, the observer only checks at a specific moment, like the end of the interval. Another trap is forgetting the bias. Partial interval tends to overestimate behavior, and whole interval tends to underestimate it. A third trap is choosing discontinuous measurement when continuous measurement would clearly be more precise. A good strategy question to ask yourself in scenarios is, what is the observer actually doing? Watching the whole interval, or just checking at one moment? The answer will usually point you directly to the method. When you're picking a method, on the exam or in practice, start with the goal. If you want to increase engagement or on-task behavior and keep it going, whole interval is often recommended. If your goal is to decrease problem behavior, partial interval is frequently used. If you're in a busy classroom with many students to watch, MTS is often the most practical choice. Then look at the observer's behavior. If they're watching the entire interval and only scoring yes when behavior is present the whole time, that's whole interval. If they're watching the entire interval and scoring yes when behavior happens at all, that's partial. If they're just checking at specific time points, that's MTS. On the exam, underline key phrases in the scenario to help you match it to the right method. To really lock in discontinuous measurement, you need repetition with good feedback, reading scenarios, identifying the method, and predicting how it will affect the data. That's exactly what we built into BCBA full-length BCBA mock exams that simulate the real test, topic-by-topic video explanations for areas like measurement and data interpretation, and extra practice questions so you can see these concepts from many angles. If this walkthrough helped discontinuous measurement finally click, imagine having this level of clarity for every exam topic. Head over to BCBAmockexam.com. Keep studying smarter.